And welcome back. Our second section on the foreign, strategic, and international dimension of Hugh Segal's thought and impact. So I have my great pleasure in introducing Mel Cappe, who will moderate this afternoon's session. Mel has one of the most distinguished careers in the Canadian Public Service, many deputy ministerships, Clerk of the Privy Council, High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, President of the IRPP, as Hugh was, a professor at the Monk School, where I believe he even taught one of the introductory courses, which is almost beyond courage. And senior fellow here at Massey College, so a man who knows about public policy and in particular international policy, and who knew Hugh Segal very well. Mel Cappe.
Thanks, Tom. So as everyone has said, and I will join, thanking the organizers. I think this is a terrific event, and unfortunately, the one person who should be here isn't, and that's Hugh. One of the things I learned from Hugh Segal, and I think I would bet that most of us did, if not all of us, was the role of anecdote and humor. And so I'm going to tell a couple of anecdotes and try to draw a lesson from each of them. The first time I ever spoke to Hugh Segal was about 1988, maybe 1989. I was an official in the Government of Canada, and we were working on the Lobbyist Registration Act. And it was, Harvey was my minister in the Mulroney government. And the day before we tabled the legislation, he says, somebody better call Hugh Segal and tell him that the rules are going to change and that he's going to have to register as a lobbyist. And so I find Hugh Segal and I call him up and I tell him that we're about to table the bill and he'll have to lobby, and he'll have to register. And Hugh says, I won't have to register. I never lobby, he says. And there's a really interesting little lesson from that, and that is Hugh's positiveness, his optimism, the way he looked positively on everything that happened. The second one was, or another one was when Hugh was appointed to the Senate. And he would love to tell the story that Paul Martin called him up, and it was a Liberal Prime Minister who appointed him, summoned him to the Senate. And Hugh told the then Prime Minister, but Prime Minister, know that I will do everything I can to bring down your government. And Martin said, do you have to? The lesson in this, though, was about institutional effectiveness, and that was a question that came up in the last session, talking about Hugh's approach to this stuff. I was fortunate enough, Hugh, to get summoned to the Senate, which freed up the IRPP job just at the time when I was finishing my time as High Commissioner in London. And I said to my wife, gee, you know, I'd really like that job. And fortunately, the headhunter called, asking me if I knew of anybody who might be good. And then, so I asked Hugh, how would you know you've been, so after I got the job, I talked to my predecessor and said, how would you know you've been successful? And he told this wonderful little story, and he said, in the 2005 December leaders debate for the 2006 election, it was an IRPP study that Martin cited to justify his healthcare policy. And it was a different IRPP study that Stephen Harper cited to justify his healthcare policy. And he said, that's how I knew I was successful. And indeed, the lesson to draw from that was the notion of Hugh's contribution to informing the debate. And we heard earlier in panels, people talk about evidence, and he was very much a step-by-step kind of person. And my answer to Keith Banting's question in the previous panel, along the lines of Bill Fox's response, was that yes, Hugh has advanced the yardsticks. He's moved things along. And nothing gets done in one swell foop, and that it takes a number of stages, and that he was good at getting there. I also spent a lot of time in that office, Nathalie, with Hugh, working on the Canada-UK colloquium with Tina and Hugh. And I mean, Hugh, I know that some of them are watching actually from London, but the Brits, he loved them deeply, and they drove him crazy. And so it was a love-hate relationship, but the first Canada-UK colloquium I remember was in Quebec City. The first one that I met Hugh at was in Quebec City, and it was on the Anglosphere. And Hugh changed the title to The Saxophony, which I thought was brilliant. At the weekly meetings we would have in that office, Hugh would talk, we would talk about our grandfathers, both immigrants from Eastern Europe, and it was Hugh's sort of sense of history and evolution that was so important. And then the Commonwealth. So Hugh was an eminent person. I think we all know that of Hugh, but he was formally in the eminent persons group set up by the Secretary General. It was first established in 1985 and then reconvened in 2009, and Hugh was made the Canadian rep, although there wasn't a rep from every country. There were only about 8 members, and Hugh was a rep. And every time he would have one of his members come in, and if it was Sir Ronald Saunders of Jamaica, or Sir Jeremy Rifkin, Sir Malcolm Rifkin of the United Kingdom, Hugh would set up a dinner or a lunch, and I got to go, and there was always a substantive discussion, and I think that was the important thing. And this was Hugh's attempt to make the world a better place. And I'll just read you, so 2009 they EPG, and then in 2011 they issue a report. And the report has the following chapter headings: championing values, functional cooperation, consensus building, fit for purpose, and a commonwealth of the people. And that is just a brilliant summary of Hugh and what he stood for. So with that, let me now turn to introduce the panel, which is my job. So we are really fortunate to be able to hear from 3 distinguished and interesting and knowledgeable people, knowledgeable of Hugh, but knowledge of substance and the subject matter. So we have Anne Fitz-Gerald, who will speak first. And Anne is the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs and a professor of political science at Wilfrid Laurier. And she worked at King's College and London University and Cranfield University, has a long list of accomplishments, applications, has been a visiting professor at more universities than I've ever seen, let alone attended, was a senior research associate at Rosiers in London, and a visiting professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. And Anne will speak first. She'll be followed by Naval Captain Wade Carter. And Wade was one of the commissioning crew members of the HMCS Halifax and went on to command the HMCS Charlottetown in 2012. And as most of you know, Hugh was an honorary naval captain, and this was important to him. And Wade will be able to give us more on. And also, Wade was director of the Asia-Pacific Policy Development at National Defense Headquarters and wrote naval strategy for the Royal Canadian Navy. Now he's a member of the Naval Reserve. So Captain Carter will be able to give us a fair bit of insight. He has a Master's of Defense Studies and an MBA. And will be followed, he will be followed by Janice Stein, who is the Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management at the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto and the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, the Order of Canada, the Order of Ontario, etc., etc. And so I will not go through, I will mention, though, that Janice was responsible for the National Advisory Committee on Canada's Indo-Pacific Strategy. And so I think we'll hear from all three of our panelists on this. So, Anne, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mel and Tom, for organizing this very important, relevant event. It's so good to see so many of you. I know we gathered a few weeks ago in Kingston on a couple of occasions, and we share a common thing in this room. Hugh was a great friend to all of us. He was a mentor to me. He was a co-author. He was a second father. He stepped in that role after I lost my father many years ago and has guided me with the clearest beacon since those days. And I know I'm not the only one in the room that could say things. He was a unique individual who made so many contributions, not just to political science and public policy, but to friendship. And for myself, his humor, his infectious laugh, always kept our long discussions vibrant and enjoyable. Whether these were from the UK, the Middle East, or the African continent, and some of you who know me know I only returned back to Canada after being abroad for 25 years, a few years ago when I took the job at the Balsillie School. But I knew that no matter where I called him from, he would always make the time and have the time to pick up or send me a note to say that he would revert soon. Revert soon. I remember that clearly. He taught us how to learn rather than what to learn, and that was something that I always greatly respected with Hugh. And his deep knowledge, I'm sure you'll agree, of history, general history, always gave his interventions and comments a huge amount of momentum right from the start. And there were anecdotes tied to the history, and there were deep challenges to mainstream thinking and mainstream norm thinking tied to his great historical knowledge as well. He was so energetic and committed to all the major roles he held, and there were so many. And Mel, I'm so glad you mentioned the Commonwealth role and Canada's representative to the Commonwealth. This was significant, and it's often something that is perceived to have become so big that it's unmanageable as a policy space. So, but it was important. He brought an important Commonwealth perspective to foreign policy, and he had tremendous influence in this circle. And of course, the Commonwealth was an important foreign policy tool for a country like Canada. I remember walking up to, because I spent many years in the UK, in both Oxford and London, and when he came, he sometimes stayed with our family, and sometimes I would go and meet him in London. And Trafalgar Square often was the meeting place. And I popped up the Bakerloo line, and he said, "Meet me on the stairs." And so I met him on the stairs of Canada House, and I'm sure you will all be familiar with that grand staircase that goes up from Trafalgar Square to Canada House. Anyway, there was a photo shoot with all the members of this Commonwealth meeting, and Hugh was, as ever, trying to step to the and allowing those a few more notches above him to take the place in the middle, where all the Commonwealth members were grabbing him to take the place in the middle, and even calling him Secretary General at times, and I just sat back and watched with tremendous pride and giggled. He brought tremendous energy to his role as honorary captain in the Navy, and I'm so glad that we have a member from the Navy on the panel today. His role as honorary captain at the Canadian Forces in Toronto and as an honorary doctorate causa from the RMC of Canada. And despite having a number of honorary doctorates, he was particularly proud of this one. And as the first civilian female to graduate from RMC, our collective pride in this institution reinforced our joint research interests. Hugh and I co-published many articles and op-eds. We also co-chaired a number of research projects, including projects on national security issues. Hugh was a great practitioner of the golden rule, scrupulously honest. He could walk both sides of the without crossing the road. And Mel, you cited a great anecdote that brings light to that statement. He saw all views and represented these views equitably without ever compromising his own principles. On issues concerning national security, Hugh was concerned, as was I, with the country's lack of strategic level civil capability for ongoing evidence-based horizon scanning and analysis. He wasn't necessarily sold on the idea that Canada absolutely needed a National Security Council, but he was quite concerned that the one cross-government structure that dealt with multifaceted threats, the Incident Response Group, was too reactionary and not therefore anticipatory or preventative. Hugh and I also deepened our research activity based on a view that Canada's higher education system was strong and relatively strong and needed to be protected and projected. We always felt that we needed a federal Ministry of Education and that this strategic instrument of power should be relegated completely to the provincial level. We felt that there was nowhere in Canada that undergrads could get a substandard first degree. You could get a good degree anywhere in Canada, and for a decent price. And yet, it bothered us a little bit that the global view was that the UK and the US remained the destinations of choice. But we knew that would change, and I feel, and Hugh felt even months ago, that there is a window of opportunity for that change to happen over the coming years. And we both really hoped that Canada would grab this opportunity and project itself more in the higher education sector. We also felt that education, and post-grad education in particular, could be used more effectively as a diplomatic tool and for diplomatic projection purposes. Hugh was passionate about the Canadian Armed Forces and its place in the world. For Hugh and I, people who have worked and lived with the Canadian Armed Forces, different times, different places in Haiti, Bosnia, South Sudan, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and elsewhere. Although we knew that traditional peacekeeping became very quickly a relic of the past, especially with a new wave of counterinsurgency and digital insurgency, two wars, one on the internet, one on the ground. These days, we believed in the capability of Canada, a country which supported diversity, inclusivity, and federated structures. And a lot of countries in conflict-affected areas are based on federated structures and systems. And we felt that Canada could share a lot with them and Canada's own struggles and challenges. And we didn't really have a colonial cloak or any powerfully imposing foreign policy interests. So to continue being engaged through military and security training and education, also, which could be offered in the French language, which is something that we felt could set Canada apart from other countries, particularly on the African continent. But decades-long demises of the budgets for the armed forces meant that the emperor would soon be lacking clothes, and that there would be many challenges now facing the Canadian Armed Forces, as we see, and this was something that for people who had been with the armed forces in theater a lot and saw the impact they had at tables, multinational tables, and multinational operations, this was something that distressed us. Hugh stood for all soldiers, sailors, and aircrew. He reminded people often of the contribution made by the Navy, and he was a fierce proponent of the use of the Navy as a diplomatic instrument of power. And this enormous and underreported role that the Navy could play in projecting Canada's interests abroad led him to, following his time in London, and actually I have no evidence yet to make this connection, but I just know it was him. So he came over to London, stayed with us for a few days, had meetings at the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defense, And 3 days after he left, and he had spoken about the Navy and its tool of diplomatic power, I got a call from the Ministry of Defense. It said, hello, we're looking for people who will go and sail with the Navy for a few weeks because we feel that their role in peacekeeping is very underreported. Hugh? And anyway, he denied it vehemently, but here I found myself waking up on a suitcase at 4 a.m. in the morning in Hania, Crete, as a magnificent vessel approached me, which was HMS Chatham, after its long tour through Hong Kong for the handover in Hong Kong and the Dubai Straits. And he told me to make the most of the opportunity, and I learned a lot about being away with the Navy as opposed to the Army. And suffice it to say that Hugh was thrilled that I was able to use words like the heads and the wardroom instead of the loos and the officer's mess. We both cared deeply for the developing world and the African continent in particular. I lived and worked there for many years. Hugh led a number of studies on aid effectiveness in Africa. We wrote on issues concerning conflict and conflict resolution in a number of regions. At one stage, we found ourselves writing on the delicate issue of US foreign policy in some African regions and the growing nature of Africa becoming a proxy battle space for the great powers. And we appealed for Canada in a number of op-eds not to blindly follow the US lead on the continent. We also found ourselves in the midst of a number of digital insurgency wars and quickly realized with each conflict we wrote on, there was one conflict on the ground and another one on the internet, and both looked very different to each other. These digital insurgencies are the name of the game these days and go well beyond the foreign interference that targeted elections and even politicians. Hugh and I learned about how an essential ingredient of Mao Zedong's insurgency doctrine applied to the digital space is all about delegitimizing those whose evidence-based narratives is at odds with an insurgency narrative. We saw a number of Canadian scholars, including ourselves, under attack. Letters were written to our MPs, our university presidents, to the publishing houses we published in, to the point where Hugh would call me in the morning after he looked at his inbox, and that was early, more than me. And we would compare notes, and it almost became quite competitive. And he would say, did you get that one? Did you get that one? Did you get the one sent to CNN? Anyway, he became very aggrieved when I suddenly got sanctioned by the Russian government, and he didn't. He said, what did you say? I said, I don't know, I just said very generally that they had violated international law and invaded a sovereign state. And he said, did I tell you to write that? And anyway, we saw AI-driven bot traffic, trolling social media posts, platforming our articles. So although we tried to stay composed through all of this, I know that Hugh was becoming increasingly concerned about how Canada's strongest sectors, the higher education sector, was getting penetrated, and that it could happen much easier in a diverse democracy which stood staunchly behind human rights and freedoms like Canada, to the point where institutions could unknowingly provide a platform for ill-intentioned groups. And we realized then that data and information would be Canada's critical tool of national power in the future. I'll just finish by saying that Hugh then became concerned that these attacks, particularly targeting women and people he knew well, would bring some of us down or lead us to being digitally silenced. And his protective horns came out for those of us affected. He checked on us regularly. And in doing so, he reminded us of the King Mitchell song, I Won't Back Down, and continuously reiterated the importance of continuing to stand for what was right and proper and for the evidence-based truth. So while we all continue to miss Hugh greatly, we can surely learn from many of these principles and handrails that he left us with. Thank you very much.
That was awesome. Thank you. There's a tough axe to follow from this morning. I want to thank the organizers, Nathalie and Tom and Mel, for inviting me today. I was delighted to attend. The commander and the deputy commander could not attend. The deputy asked me to do so. I immediately said yes. It was evident to me from this morning there's a great deal of affection in this room for Hugh. That makes a lot of sense. You knew him very well. I can't claim to have known him as well. I have met him on a number of occasions, and my impressions are very similar and reinforce from what I heard today. So thank you. In particular, I feel that he was passionately dedicated to the public discourse. He's very eloquent and deliberate in communications. He's very receptive to us, right, as students. I didn't first meet him. My second meeting with Hugh was at the Canadian Forces College in Toronto in 2008, I think, or 2009, and very receptive to points of view, right? So it was great to have discussions with him. He'd listen to you as a student, which was awesome. But mostly, the impression I was left with overall was just how kind he was as a human being. So that left an indelible mark on me, and I don't recall the specifics of what he spoke to us about that day, but I do remember a couple of things he told me, because we had a tradition in college that we would take naval officers, including honorary captains, for a glass of port after a discussion or an event, and I can't recall if he took it or not. I'm not going to say if he did or not, but he definitely attended with us, and it was a wonderful opportunity to talk to him one-on-one. He's very personable in that way. But I'll clock back a little bit. I first met him in 2005 in Kingston. I was working at the Joint Headquarters. I was a lieutenant commander. I was part of the staff there. As you know, Canadian Forces is a unified force, and so I was working for the Army at the time. And he embarked in one of our ships that was on a Great Lakes tour, HMCS Toronto. It was commanded then by now retired Navy Captain Stu Morse. And I don't know if you've ever met Stu Morse, but a very delightful person. And Stu invited me on board for the reception, and then there was going to be an evening dinner with hosting Senator Segal, and I believe it was Joel Sokowski from RMC at the time, or Queens. Yeah, so he was on board for that event. So it was a pretty interesting academic discussion, as I recall. It was an interesting evening. But the reason why I mentioned to you that I met him on, I talked about the event when I talked in 2008 first, and I met him in 2005, because when I first met him, my overwhelming impression was just how happy he was. And I didn't realize at the time it's because he had been appointed to the Senate that day. I found it a little bit surprising that he'd be so happy, because in Kingston, the ship can't come alongside because the harbor's not deep enough. So we had to anchor the ship, and then we had to send in a dispatch boat to pick him up. And it was late, I think late summer, if I recall correctly. It was in the evening. It was a beautiful night. It was really nice and warm, but it was really blustery, quite windy. And so I thought it would be a bit of a choppy ride out to the ship, and I thought he might be a little ill when he got there, but he didn't seem like it. He seemed very happy to be there. So that was my initial impression of Mr. Segal, and it was reinforced a few years later when I met him a second time at the college, as I mentioned. As already mentioned, he was an honorary captain in the Navy. We got to him first in 2004, right? So a year before the Senate. And fortunately, he accepted. I think, as all, I'm going to be telling you a few things you already know, and I apologize if that's the case. By the way, I'm here today, Janice, with Captain Tim O'Leary. He's the Seal York. And he told me he was a student of yours, and I think he still owes you an assignment. He mentioned that, now he's shrinking down there high and high. Yeah, so, yeah. So the RCN, as you know, is a senior in the Canadian Forces, and has a long and storied history. And like Canada itself, it spans the nation, reserves and regular force elements drawn from and representative of every province and territory. And it's a complex enterprise, as former defense ministers in the audience will tell you, I'm sure, if you ask. And so from time to time, the RCN, like the other services, seek out inputs from captains of industry or lifelong public servants like you to help us understand how to operate and run the organization well and thoughtfully. And Hugh, thankfully, he agreed to do that for the Navy, and we were grateful, very grateful for his service in that regard. His service and advocacy on the part of the RCN, it was previously mentioned, was of tremendous value, and he will be sorely missed. But like all ranks of all who served, and he will never be forgotten. And in that regard, I have a coin from the Commander of the Navy. I recognize I'm in a room full of Orders of Canada, so it's a subordinate award, certainly. But nonetheless, it's important, and I'd like to present it to Nathalie on behalf of the Commander of the Navy, because this shows our deep respect for the contribution that Hugh made. I'm not sure if you have a...
Yes, we do.
There you go. So if you could display that, I'd very much appreciate it. Now, if I could turn my attention briefly to topical subjects for the panel, specifically defense and foreign policy. As stated in my bio so well by Mel, I'm a life naval officer, and so I do not write policy, right? I'm not going to take credit for that. But I do, however, study the implications of policy as a strategic planner, and from time to time I have provided advice on its formulation. Most recently, I spent 4 years, in 2016 to 2020, working closely with the United States Navy in Hawaii at the U.S. Pacific Fleet Headquarters, where we stared constantly and deliberately at the China problem. Subsequently, returning to Canada in 2020, I worked as a director of Indo-Pacific policy, as was mentioned, where I believe I had, in some small measure, of influence on the convincing policymakers to take a more proactive stance in the South China Sea region and the Taiwan Strait, on behalf of our Navy in particular. In my final year and a half before training to the Reserve Force, I worked with the naval staff in Ottawa, drafting strategy. And some of the strategies that I'm going to remark upon today, recently approved by the commander, largely written by Dr. Ben Lombardi. I'm not sure if you know him or not, but he's a defense scientist who works with us, peer-reviewed work, and will be shared if desired. It's written at the unclassified level, but it's a very good discussion. You are possibly familiar with the product of one of the two documents that were produced during my time with the Navy Strategic Staff, as it's already published to the web, and that's the RCN Arctic and Northern Strategic Framework document. It's obviously subordinate to the national policy framework in that matter. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that document unless you want me to, because it's on the web, right? So, and as you know, we're already building ships to operate in the Arctic. We're learning how to do it up there. We are engaging with the local population as we do so as not to cause any harm. And we embrace and welcome foreign partners to work with us in the Arctic as we learn how to operate there and be present in the Arctic. That's essentially what the document says, but it's about 10 pages. It's an interesting read if you have a chance. The second document, probably not as well known, or if known to you, is recently, as I said, approved by the commander of the Navy, is known as the Oceans and Great Power Competition in Our Era. Now, that is an analytical document. It's not a strategy document. It's a document that we wrote to analyze what's going on in the world. We write those documents every few years as internal documents for the department. We don't normally share them because they're normally qualitative and quantitative in terms of understanding what our allies and potential adversaries have in their order of battle for types of vessels and what they can do and that sort of thing. So I think you'd probably end up sticking pins in your eyes to try to stay awake if you wanted to read that. But this current one is a little bit different. It's more a reflection on the geostrategic circumstances that have changed, largely as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? So it's a little more strategic in its approach. It's about 8 chapters and 100 pages, so I'm not going to go through it here with you and try to defend it today. But like I said, I'm happy to share it with the college if you want to see it. I will summarize it, though, for you. It has as one of its principal features a recognition that both China and Russia today are revisionist powers, effectively. Their leadership are revisionist, in the sense that they would claim, they may not claim, but it seems obvious, that they do not believe that they're beneficiaries to the degree that the Western nations have from the post-Bretton Woods Institute, right? So as a consequence, they want to rewrite certain parts of the world order. And from the Navy standpoint, the thing that concerns us are things like UNCLOS, right? The law of the sea. Right? So when you see a country like China insisting that they ought to have the right to stipulate or require foreign nations, even with sovereign immune vessels, to request permission to enter the EEZ, a concern, right? We understand the idea of territorial seas, 12 miles, but the Taiwan Strait is not an EEZ, right? Sorry, it is an EEZ, but it's not a territorial sea. So it's part of the discussion ahead. That's reflected in the documents, pretty robustly characterized and researched. It also will stipulate that the character of the region, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, because that's where the world seems to be turning its attention with evolving economies, is the character is overwhelmingly maritime in nature, as opposed to the previous century, where we largely looked at potential conflicts that were more continental in Europe and Asia. It's not the same today. This is shifting to focus more on the maritime theater. This takes us to what we consider to be an era of ocean politics that is emerging now, that is unlike any that we've seen in the last 100 years. Of course, freedom of seas and multiple overlapping claims in the South China Sea region are potential flashpoints for conflict, but it's really the Taiwan that has the most potential to spark a direct conflict between the great powers in the short to medium term, in our estimation. One of the questions I had at the policy level in Ottawa when I was working there is, why should we be interested in the South China Sea? Why is that important to Canada? Well, it was an interesting point because there was some concern about whether or not we would be infringing upon territorial claims of the various states that have claims in the area. But I had to point out to the staff that I said, I understand it's over our visual horizon, but you need to think of it a little bit differently. The reality is the South China Sea is 1.5 times the size of the Mediterranean Sea, right? It might not look like that on a globe when you look at it, but when you actually take a closer look, you realize just how large a body of water that is. So it's not really sensible to allow one nation, in my estimation, in my advice, to claim it, right? Now, I'm not saying they do. There's many overlapping claims in that area. But it's also not sensible for Canada to avoid it, right? We don't avoid the Mediterranean, so why would we avoid the South China Sea, right? So that was the advice I gave. I think it resonated to some degree. And so now we operate there again more freely than we have in the past. In a similar way, the Taiwan Strait is almost 100 miles wide at its narrowest point, right? When you consider that territorial seas are 12 miles, at most that would be 24 miles if you accepted the argument that China owned Taiwan. That still leaves 70 miles in the center that's international waters, right? So that you're not making, as a ship transits through there, you're not making an assertion that we're violating someone's territorial waters or that we're infringing on a particular claim. That's not Canada's intent in doing that, right? So it's just the fact that we're operating in international space, right? Like we always have marine vessels. So that's part of the advice I've given. I have more. Do I have more time, Mel? Okay, why don't I stop there? I'm happy to take questions. I probably stirred the pot sufficiently, but thank you.